Hey everybody, welcome to the creative track on screenwriting. I'm very excited about everybody that we have on this panel today. We're going to talk about all things screenwriting, and it's going to be great. We're going to do questions at the end, probably the last 10 minutes, so post any questions you have in the comments, and it helps us if you put question great big beforehand so that we can kind of pick it out from the comments. I'm going to have the panelists introduce themselves, so go for it. Who wants to start us off?
Go ahead.
Vlas, Parlapanides.
And I'm Vlas's brother, Charlie Parlapanides. We're a writing team, primarily in features, but we've developed before in TV and do animation as well.
And I'm Darrell Gabonia. I'm a writer based out of Hilo, Hawaii. All
right, guys. Right on. Well, let's dig into this because we've got a lot of content to cover. What I'd really like to start off with is learning about your processes and the discovery and development phase that you all kind of work. Darrell works on. I'm familiar with what Darrell works on, and I'm familiar with what you guys work on. Let's talk about your discovery and development process. Especially I'm personally curious about Blood of Zeus and that discovery development process because that's a very interesting take on that storyline. So.
Well,
let's
hear
hear about
when
that.
You're a writing team because Charlie had the idea, so that's the discovery.
It's just that came from just our deep love of Greek mythology. And whenever you pitch executives kind of the traditional tried and true stories, their eyes kind of glaze over and they feel that they've been there, done that. Even if they have a great affinity for Greek mythology, they know that there's been 10 Hercules movies. And they feel that that's kind of been run into the ground. And so, to be honest, the idea for Blood of Zeus kind of came from, we had this idea to do kind of almost an American Horror Story anthology type show, but spend one season on each kind of Greek mythological tale, starting with Icarus and Daedalus. And that never went anywhere. But when we were breaking down those stories, there's a couple of other stories that intersect that. And if you really were to take half of one and half of the other, those are really the bones for Blood of Zeus. And we said, oh, wow, that's kind of interesting. Like if you were to flip a couple of the dynamics here, that would be a really interesting story. And then again, because we've always kind of pitched Greek mythology and been turned down, we said, we're going to postulate this as a lost story. This was an oral tradition. This isn't like the Bible. There wasn't an ecumenical council where they sat down and they said, here, this is the one definitive version. And since it was an oral tradition, we're going to just postulate that this is a lost story. And then all of a sudden, like you see the executives, they sit up and they're like, oh, that's interesting. And so part of it is having fun in a sandbox that we've always loved. And two is getting past the gatekeepers.
And as Charlie said, too, it starts with asking questions. What if we were to postulate that this is one of those stories that was lost? And we always ask ourselves questions, what haven't we seen before? Because that's important. We're living at a certain time where listen, they say there's like 30 stories, more or less. So you do try to make it as original and as new as you can possibly make it. And that for us stems with asking questions. And it helps because we bounce those questions off of each other. And then we both know it's pretty good when we're like, oh, why didn't we think of that? That's when you have a good, big idea.
Or when you have general meetings and you pitch just the seed of the idea to executives, and you can see kind of like, which ones they gravitate to and which ones have an impact and which ones they're interested in.
What's the line of when you're dealing with something as well known, one of the original stories, right? Greek mythology. What's the line? How much can you mess with it before you're now just creating something new?
You don't know the answer to that question. It's trial and error. And, you just kind of, I think, approach it from a place of, well, what interests us? What moves us emotionally? And you hope that if it moves us emotionally, that it'll do the same for a reader, for an audience. But as Charlie said, too, it really does help to have some of these generals because you can see it in an executive's face. They'll like kind of lean up and move a little forward when it's an idea that they kind of like. And then you kind of know that you have something that at least is interesting. And then you build it out, and it's trial and error. You know, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't.
Okay. Darrell, let's talk a little bit about your discovery and development process, because I know it's pretty interesting.
Yeah, I don't know. I feel like most of my better ideas come out when I'm just talking with creative people, because it'll lead to, like, I'll say something that's kind of half baked, then someone will say like, oh, what if it went this? And then, like, you know, the jerk inside of me like, that's a bad idea, but this is a better idea. And then then you know, ultimately be like, that's not that good of an idea. I'm like, yeah, you're right. Maybe I should rework it. But then it'll, like, you know, become something. So I think for me, it's more like developing ideas in the shower when I'm just like, you know, having my shower thoughts, and bouncing ideas off of friends and creative people, and even sometimes like non-creative people. I mean, all people are pretty creative, but, you know, people who don't do creative things for a living, they have insight that I just don't have, and they'll say something like kind of offhanded, and like, I never thought of it that way. Also, I get people who don't really work in the creative field, they instinctively know what's cliched, even though they can't really express it. Like, so if I have an idea and I say something, they're like, oh, it's kind of like this and this and this. I'm like, oh yeah, we've seen it like 700 times, I guess.
You're in good company. Ernst Lehman, you know, the writer from North by Northwest, said he got his best ideas in the shower. And sometimes as a writer, we always joke, you know, there's a lot to like about it, but the downside is like, it's like always having homework. So whatever you're trying to figure out, you're always thinking about it. So you're thinking about it, whether you want to or not, in the shower, when you're going to the bathroom, on the way to work, when you're walking. And oftentimes, I have to agree with you, you get your best ideas when you least expect them. And I love the idea when you said sometimes it's half-baked. That's how I feel. Sometimes I'll come with Charlie, something half-baked, but it'll be like, but then what if we do this? And then we'll go back and forth, and then we get to a good idea.
Never disregard those invisible steps that get you there. And that's why you have to be willing to just throw it all out there. Like, you know, an older writer once told us, he's like, if you want to write, you have to be brave. And part of that is true, just in the sense that you have to be willing to put your ideas out there, and you have to be willing to kind of like bang it around the marketplace of ideas and see where it percolates and where it ends. Because sometimes where you start and where you end, they seem so far apart. But if you didn't take those invisible steps, you never would have got there.
Yeah, I mean, I've written a TV pilot that is doing pretty well, and I found that what I was writing was actually the backstory for the exciting part of the script. So I went through about 10 drafts before I realized, you know what? This is the backstory. The interesting story is when this finishes, and I had to throw it entirely out. And that was a very scary thing. But like you said, being brave is half the battle.
Well, look at The Sixth Sense. You know, apparently, I don't know how many drafts M. Night Shyamalan wrote. I read somewhere, I think it was like 19 drafts at one time, you know, page one rewrites. So writing is rewriting. And you do have to be brave enough to say, you know what, this doesn't work. You throw it into the garbage, but there's something here that works. And like you said, oftentimes you do write, I would say, the backstory, but that's part of the process, because now you have more of an awareness of your character, of your situation. And then it's the next draft that, you know, takes it to that next developmental stage.
Yeah. Eric Roth said it once he's a very famous writer, one of the all-time, greats. And he said, someone asked him, what's the difference between being a writer and someone that just kind of dabbles in it? And what he said is that if you get 50 pages in and you realize you're going down the wrong path and you can throw those 50 pages in the garbage and start over, you're a writer. If that makes you like walk away from the story, then you're not a writer. And there's truth in that.
Yeah, I just going back to like bouncing ideas off of people. I remember I wrote something that I was really, really proud of, and I showed it to a friend who is he's a non-writer. He's actually a pharmacist, but he loves movies. So he read the screenplay and he said, these three characters, their dialogue sounds exactly the same. Like they're like the same people. And I was like, and at first I was insulted, like, what do you know? You're a pharmacist. And then I was like, oh my God, you're right. These three people are just they say the exact same thing. They talk the exact same way. So yeah, you never know. You gotta, as a writer, you have to be humble to these notes and like, I turned out a better screenplay because of him.
Yeah, so let's talk about world building for a minute here, because
it's happened to all of us too. Okay, so we've been there. We feel your pain. We get it.
So world building. How much world building for a screenplay is too much? It's a question I get a lot, and both set, everybody we have here builds big worlds. So
I would say that, listen, too, there are different drafts for different purposes, and part of it is I think you do yourself a great injustice if you restrict yourself or constrain yourself. So part of it is, like what we always say, is that what's great about writing and rewriting is that you always have that other draft. So if there's a draft where you really want to dive deep and create this huge world and get into genealogies, God bless, great. But just know that at some point the world building has to service the story. But part of it is, if you don't take the time to dream in that world and to write it out and think about it and live in it, you might not create something interesting enough for the characters to live in. So part of it is, like, in the end, you do have to be disciplined, but don't put those, restraints on yourself from get-go, or else you're going to limit yourself. Why inhibit yourself? So you do have to have that discipline in the end, but at first, run wild. Who knows? Like you said, you had to write a bunch of drafts of a pilot to find your story. Sometimes you have to create this world, and this huge world that might have 3 layers, and then you realize you only need 1 for this movie. But it's good to know that those other, elements exist.
I would just quote Goldman, to be honest. I think what Charlie said, that's sage advice. But also, too, there's part of me, like, nobody knows anything, man. Like, it could be someone, like, you say, that's the worst idea ever, and that's the one that sells. And it was like, they overrode it. And the one thing that he also said that I agree with Goldman is, like, do they want to turn the page? So I think if you're reading it and you're building a world, if you don't want to turn the page, then you got a problem. Maybe there's too much novelization or something. But as long as there's that will to turn the page, maybe that could be a barometer of sorts. It's a good question.
What do you think, Darrell?
Yeah.
No, and I totally agree. I think the best world building is when you have enough that the viewer or the reader can just fill in the rest. Like, I always think of, like, Game of Thrones as world building, where, back in when I would hang out with my friends in the bar, we would talk about Game of Thrones, and I'm sure, like, tons of people would do this, where they would be like, oh, my house would be this would be my sigil, this would be my motto, and it just when the way Game of Thrones did it was, like, it was piecemeal. They kind of, like, here's a little bit of the world, here's a little. They didn't, like, set you down Lord of the Rings style, which also is great world building, but explain everything for 10 minutes, like, in a world where fire and ice, and they just let these characters breathe in this world, and it became believable.
Good advice.
So there's that assumption, right, that if you get dropped into the middle of your world, right off the bat, scene 1, we just drop the audience in and let them catch up, that they actually absorb it better than being spoon-fed it, right? So, I've always felt like it's a delicate balance between, assuming your reader's going to catch up and giving them enough information to make sure that they're not confused. But when it comes to world building as a writer, developing is important, because you as the writer have to know what you're writing. The audience can catch up, but you have to know.
I think what helped us, and I think I like both the advice that Charlie gave and that Darrell gave, what helped us, I think there's a familiarity that people have with Greek mythology. So, and Charlie's better at novelizing than I am. But I think because that familiarity existed, it helped bridge the gap between, having described every little thing, because we kind of assumed people knew some things, and we did kind of, color in other things. So for us, it was helpful to have and to work in a space that people were familiar with to a certain extent. Obviously, there's some people that are more familiar with it than others, but I felt like that helped us.
And the example of Game of Thrones, I think it's sometimes very smart, is that if you create something built off of pre-existing archetypes, so people understood the Middle Ages, and Martin said this is very much based off of the wars in the Middle Ages between houses, and so some people had a kind of cursory knowledge of being part of a house and having a sigil and having to provide soldiers for the king. So now they added all this other great world building, and in the north they're frost giant, not frost giants, but the White Walkers and all these other things. But it did help, like that there was some kind of foothold that people kind of understood and recognized, but then he just made it fantastical. And so that sometimes too is a good kind of point of view to have. That is there something that we can recognize, that we can give that 10% of strange, 5% of fantastical, that now makes it feel like something else, but people aren't completely, without a footing.
Yeah, I had a teacher in film school, an instructor in film school, who said all the time the role of the filmmaker is to make the ordinary extraordinary. And I think that starts with the screenwriting, right? Find something that people are familiar with and flip it on its head, make it different, make people want to absorb it again. So on that note, let's shift to characters, right? World building, we've got our setting. Characters. Now, I've watched Blood of Zeus. I've read Darrell's scripts, and I've seen the stuff that he's done, and I know that everybody here is really great at crafting character. What's the secret? How do you craft a good character in a good setting?
Darrell, you go first this time.
I don't know if there's an easy answer to that.
That's why I asked the question.
Yeah, sometimes I've written things where I've thought like the character's great and people just don't respond to it. And then I've written things where like, oh, this character's kind of boring, and then people really respond to it, like to a shocking amount. Like, I thought that character was just, but whatever. I think, I don't know. It's one of those things where like what makes someone compelling. It's I guess relatability in a sense, drive for a purpose, a clear goal and a clear moral compass. And when I say clear moral compass, I don't mean like they're good or bad. I mean like, they have more, like you can, like in The Boys, for example, like if you see Billy Butcher, you're like, his moral compass is amoral. He'll do whatever it takes. I think those things kind of make things compelling. I think maybe especially nowadays in modern storytelling, characters are more like in the 70s. They're more not quite anti-heroes, but they're more gray. Where we live in a world where we don't really know what's right and wrong. So maybe that's more compelling to audience. But again, it's a big question. I don't really know the answer to.
I don't know, Vlas, I think I know what you'll say, but part of it is always what we hope to do is try and understand what a character wants and hope that want is not only something that they want, but something that they fundamentally need, and you hope that in their journey to try and achieve that or grow to the point where they can achieve that'll be interesting. But there's all different ways to approach character. There is no right way. But what we always try and understand is, who is this person? Who were they before the story started? What makes them, who they are? We always ask, like, well, what was their childhood like? What kind of home did they grow up in? How do they react to things? Because you want to have both, internal and external flaws, and internal and external kind of, wants. And then what we always try in features is that it's kind of the Nolan thing, is that if you can tie the personal to the concept some way, and I think Inception is one of the great examples of that he is kind of haunted by what happened to his wife, and he's haunted by the fact that he planted the seed of an idea in her mind that led to her death. And now that's what he's being tasked with now as kind of the external stakes. But to accomplish the external, he has to deal with the internal. That's when you get that sphere. Nolan is so good at that. Now, I think for TV, it's a completely different thing because it's all about the character and who they are. But in movies, if you can tie, especially with what studios are looking for now, if you can somehow tie the personal to the concept, that's when you really know that you have something that they'll be interested in.
Great answers, both of them, I think. And yeah, I do go, as Charlie hinted to before, it's what Sorkin said, what do they want? And then how they go about getting that defines their character. And we live by that. If there can be an arc, I just keep thinking Nicolas Cage and adaptation. What if there is no arc? What if it just stays there? Just like,
I love that movie.
And like, there's nothing worse than an artificial arc, and you really feel like the writer, he's really trying to shove that in. And we always have these like, debates. Like, I don't know, in Gladiator, does he have an arc? Maybe he does. He has a strong want. Indiana Jones, we had this debate with Chris Morgan, the writer of Fast and Furious, and he's like, no, he has an arc. He has an arc in the Raiders of the Lost Ark. He believes in the end. And I was like, oh yeah, it is. But, he's also just so charming. He has a very strong want. I think that if there is a way to show growth for a character, that's always great. Michael Corleone in The Godfather comes to mind, and it's done in a very organic way. And if you're lucky, you can also explore theme through a character. If you can tie that into the want and the theme, and then you really have something. It's difficult though, just to, I think, encapsulate it in one way and say, this is how you write a great character, and have it like a kind of a cookie cutter approach and have it apply to anything and everything. I think just different stories are different, and the characters in those stories are different. And I think you can at the very least start off with the want, and then, as Charlie mentioned, just really know who that character is and what experiences have shaped them so that they are what they are in the beginning of that story. And if there's room for that growth, that's great, as long as it's not done in a way where it's forced or contrived.
Speaking of that, like, what about character tropes? I mean, it's something that, like in film school, all the screenwriting teachers are always like, avoid tropes. But then I've actually been in executive meetings where people would argue that, like, well, but this character should do this because this is the type of character they are. And I'm like, but that's a trope I'm supposed to avoid. Let's talk a little bit about that, because it's kind of like, like Darrell said, there's no real right answer, but I know that me personally, I love to avoid tropes or flip them on their heads or spin them.
Well, one thing I want to say, sometimes like you'll do exactly say like what executive told you to do, and then they'll come back and they'll be like, what is this? This is a trope. And then you do this. And then we know there's a funny story of that one writer where the executive, he recorded everything the executive wanted him to do. He recorded it, and then he put it in the script, and a month, 2 months later came back. He's like, this is horrible. What'd you do? And he's like, and he literally played it back for him. He was all his best, but he got him fired. The guy was still mad. And they got
fired that day.
They just to
my light fell. Sorry about
that. they don't want to. They just make it work. That's like Charlie always says it. That's the screenwriter's job, is to make it work. It's to discern between the good advice, the bad advice, and you do have to listen. Darrell said it before. You need to be humble, because you do yourself a disservice if you don't listen to a note. If they're saying something, there's a reason. Now, they may not have the solve for it, but if they're identifying something, you as a writer, and we've gotten better as we've gotten older, or just more experienced, to really address notes. So with the tropes, that's a tricky one. You just have to, at the end, I think, just do what really works for the character and the story. I'm curious what Charlie and Darrell have to say about it.
No, what I was going to say is that you just try and write the best version of the story you're trying to write. And I think that there are no rules in screenwriting. The only rule is to be interesting. And the one thing I will say is that, like, in the end, your job is to make something that is interesting and engaging and makes the reader want to turn the page. And then when you get feedback, the most important thing, the fastest way to destroy your script, is to take notes directly from someone and do exactly that. Your job, it's like when a patient walks into a doctor's office and says their back hurts, the doctor doesn't say, oh, your back hurts, and how would you fix it? Your job is to take that information and figure out what it is, because it might be their shoes, it might be their knee, it might be that they need to, wear a back brace. Like, that's why they pay you to be a writer and to revise it. When they raise an issue, you are foolish to ignore it. Now, sometimes, listen, this is a subjective business. This isn't arithmetic. It's not like 2 + 2 is 2. But I know for Vlas and I, when we write a new script, we always have 3 or 4 of our writer friends read it. And the reason we do that is that if all of them come back to us with the same note, then right away we realize, no, this is something we need to address. This
we have
is
a partnership for you too.
Exactly. And so, because sometimes one person can say something and they feel very strongly about it, but then no one else feels that way, and it's just their subjective response to it. But if 4 people are saying it, and it's now this is an objective note, and we really need to look at this. And listen, there are times where they do want something that is familiar, and so sometimes it's just being uniquely familiar. But as Vlas said, each project is different, each story is different, and you just try and do the best you can.
Darrell, you've done some coverage. You tell us a little bit about. I feel like that's a good segue for coverage. Why don't you talk a little bit about?
Yeah, I guess for people who are. I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
For people
I know
who don't know what
good stories when it comes to coverage.
Well, for people who don't know what coverage is, you can work for certain companies. Now, I used to work for a talent management company in Beverly Hills, and you would get screenplays, and then you would read them, and then you would just make notes, and then you would score different things like characters on a scale of 1 through 5, and write dialogue 1 through 5, marketability 1 through 5. Coverage. Wait, what was your question about coverage? Sorry.
I know you have some interesting coverage stories of both giving coverage and receiving coverage, and just I want to talk a little bit about that as we transition from the creation process into the business process of screenwriting.
Okay, yeah, definitely. If there are writers out there who are like trying to get into the business or want to take an extra step into getting professional feedback, and I use professional kind of loosely because sometimes it comes down to the reader and the day. Like, you might submit a screenplay and get 9s across the boards, 9s out of 10s, and then submit the exact same screenplay and it's 5s out of 10s, and it's like not marketable, not worth it. Everything needs to change. So you always have to take that with a grain of salt. But it is a good way to get your script and someone who is supposed to be objective. Like, your friends are going to be more supportive, or if your friends are really, really good friends, then they're going to be pretty harsh, which is going to be that's amazing. It's an amazing thing to have, because it's going to make your writing better. So when you send in coverage, you'll I'm not really sure how to talk about coverage. I mean, like, I've done coverage before, and I got to say I gave bad marks on a good script because I just didn't get it. And then I saw it get made, and I was like, I'm an idiot. Because, like, apparently it got made, and it was pretty popular.
I think coverage is universal in our business. I worked for a very big producer, Scott Rudin, who's produced probably close to 80 movies. And then I worked at Paramount for a long time. And one of the executives there kept the coverage from Terminator above his desk because it said, not only should this movie not be made, this script shouldn't be written, was like the final kind of coverage line. All the coverage is that basically executives are very busy, producers are very busy, agents are very busy. All the agencies get coverage done on script. So a script comes in and they pay someone to read it they pay someone $100 to read it and write up a little review of it. And it gives them a sense of how seriously they should take this project, whether they should read it themselves. They might read, I can't count the number of times where, a script would come back, like, the take home for the night. And basically you would see where the executive had read up to, because that's where the coverage was stuck in. Like, they read the first 50 pages and then they read the coverage. And then it's more like, to be honest, when you get at the studio level, really, because no one knows, very few people understand story and know what goes into making a good movie. But what they know is it talent friendly? If a director that they want to work with, if an actor they want to work with says they want to do this movie, that's all that matters. Because a lot of times, they can't discern the difference between what is a good script and what is not a good script. And it's more about the currency and excitement and heat that a script, this agent probably had their assistant read it and really liked it. Maybe then they got around to reading it and really liked it. And then they sent it to a client who liked it. Now it's talent friendly. Now this is good. There's another great story the Western Unforgiven, that Clint Eastwood. It got terrible coverage. And they said how they listed all the things that were wrong with the story and who's going to care about these prostitutes and and it's one of the great Westerns of all time. And so, but you just have to be prepared to know that your script is going to get read and going to get coverage. And even when I remember big directors and actors would submit scripts to the studio and they would be like, please don't have this covered, just read it yourself. The first thing we had to do was submit the script for coverage, and so it's just part of the game.
I would say too, I would add that I think it's smart if you want to break into the business to do coverage. I think it really helps your writing because you're also just reading a lot. You're also getting an idea of like what is being submitted and, the quality of that work. And you're looking at things that you should be looking like when you assess your own work. Just what we talked about before. Yeah, these three characters, they sound like they're speaking the same. Everyone's written that script, everyone, and so I think doing coverage is actually a good way to, build up the writing muscles. I think it's a good experience to have at some point, in the process.
Yeah, that's actually an excellent point because something I did learn doing coverage was a lot of the screenplays that ended up being, passed, or that's kind of like there's like a cycle. Like there's screenplays that's been around for like 5 or 10 years that people they just keep doing coverage for. Is that there's generally an Act 2 problem where there's no goal and there's no tension, and just like it's got like a pretty good Act 1 setup, and then Act 2 is just a coast, and it's like I'm just reading it to get to the end now. Because it's not that interesting and there's nothing to overcome. And then you get to the end, and it's hitting all the right like marks as far as like if you want to be a formulaic screenplay. I mean, there's nothing really wrong with like, hitting the right marks, but like it'll end on page 110 and like, oh yeah, on page 70 this happened, but it wasn't really exciting. It just everything was just the stakes never got big. And that's something that reading coverage was like, man, that's like when as myself as a writer, it's just like you have to increase the stakes, make it a page turner, like you guys said earlier.
I love that, and I agree. Like, and when you read a script where they keep tightening the screws and they keep escalating the stakes, and you just feel it, and it feels so good. And so, like, I think that's great advice. And it's always good to compare, oh, these didn't do it. But then when you read the one that does do it and does it well, I remember like a Paul Attanasio like script, like he would just kept tightening the screws. Donnie Brasco kept tightening the screws. And I'm like, oh, and there was the character bits and this. And it's just like, it's such a pleasure to read.
I remember reading Jamie Vanderbilt's Against All Enemies. It was 180 pages and I couldn't put it down and I ripped through the whole thing. And it was a faster read and much more enjoyable than 95-page scripts.
Or 110.
Or 110-page script.
Yeah, I think the worst coverage I ever got was I couldn't finish it. Like you can tear up my characters, you can tear up my world, you can get in a fight with me about the physics in my story, but nothing hurt more than somebody saying I couldn't finish it. Like that one sentence was the worst feedback I ever got. So, all right, let's talk. We've talked about coverage. Let's talk about. We just finished our script. We're a screenwriter. What do we do now? What's next? That's half the job, right? We have a property produced. Now what?
So much has changed in the business, and we can even talk about that a little bit. I mean, what we can do is, take you through the experience that we had and how we got started, and it is a question that, oftentimes people that are starting, they want to know the answer to that question because everyone's been there. They have that script now. There's so many different things to say. One of the things I would say, we believe in Malcolm Gladwell's 10,000 hour rule. You have to put in the hard work, the time. So if it's your very, very, very first script, my suggestion is don't try to get it to an executive. Don't try to, if you have someone in the business that to be honest, and this comes from writers far more talented than me, it's their 5th or 6th script where they really start getting good. And those are the scripts, most often, there are always exceptions, that merit, hey, taking it and bringing it to the one contact that you have. So there's that component. But let's just hypothetically say you put in your 10,000 hours, you worked very hard, you've read a lot of scripts, you've written a lot of scripts, and it's your 5th script and you feel really good about it. And then for us, it's two things. One, we had like a very kind of personal script that was there. That was like our fourth or fifth script. We gave it to a manager who used to be the head of literary at William Morris. He loved it. And he gave it to some people and he said, we really love this, but we really love this, but. And we didn't want to hear the but. The but was it's too small. It's really personal. It moves us, but it's too small. So then we're like, F that. We're going to write something where we don't hear the but. We're going to write something with a big idea. So we had the big idea, but we married the big idea to the personal. It still has to be personal in some way, or you're just writing a big idea and it won't work. And that became for us Live Bet. And that was a script that our agents really, really got excited about. They had a relationship at
Universal. It got us agents because we didn't have agents at that time.
Yeah, that's true. It went through a manager who got it to a young agent at William Morris at that time. And then he gave it to the senior agents, and they had a great relationship with Mary Parent and Scott Stuber at Universal. They read it, and they basically said, listen, what do we have to do to basically not have you go out to the town with this? We want to buy it preemptively. 50 Cent was also attached to it. And that got us invited to the party. So it goes through, so you write that script, hopefully it has a big idea, hopefully it's personal, and then you get it to a manager. Managers most often, not most often, but agents, I think nowadays won't bother to read a spec. I don't know. I think it's very—
An unrepresented writer, they will not read, under no circumstances will any lit agent in town read an unsolicited script right now. What Vlas is describing also, this was in 2006. So this was 14 years ago. The feature business has continued to contract, and it's gotten worse and worse and worse, and it's tougher and tougher. And that's why you see so many feature writers segueing into TV. But what I would just quickly say to it is that right now you cannot get an agent if you're an unrepresented writer to read your script. It's just not going to happen. Make sure it's like Vlas said, that your script is ready. Then what I would do, there's 2 or 3 screenwriting competitions that are worthwhile. If you apply to the Nickel Fellowship, which is run by the Academy of Arts and Sciences, basically the people that give out the Oscars, if you are a quarterfinalist in the Nickel Fellowship, there will be managers that will reach out to you and want to read your script. And there'll even be some agents, some young agents that will reach out to you. If you do well in the South by Southwest contest, if you get into the Sundance Lab, those are writing competitions where if you do well and you place, you will get recognition and you will get managers that will be interested in meeting with you. There are some managers that, again, agents won't read an unsolicited script, but there are some managers that will take an unsolicited script from an unrepresented writer and they'll give it to their interns to read, and you hope that it gets passed up to the chain and that they like it. And that's the way I think you have to go now, because agents won't even look at an unrepresented writer's script without a recommendation from a manager or a placement in a reputable contest.
Yeah, I think it's because there's so many so many people who are very talented writers but unreliable. So it's hard. When I worked for the talent management company, it's hard for them to take chances on unknowns unless someone can back them up. Which you like the cynical person is like, oh, it's nepotism, but no, someone's putting their reputation on the line for someone. And just for example, say James was working at William Morris, and I was like, hey man, I want to get a rep. Can you give me a representation? And he puts his reputation on the line for me, gets me representation, and they're like, okay, let's see your stuff. And my stuff is bad, or I don't do the work, or I take an upfront paycheck and I just disappear. Not only did I ruin my career, I ruined James's career. So as they were saying, you just when you want to get that representation, you really got to be ready. And like I was saying, you got to have the work, and probably not your first screenplay, because they're going to immediately be like, what else do you have? Yeah. And you're like, well, I got 4 ideas that maybe I'll write. So.
And just because you read people saying it's their first screenplay, when we sold Live Bet, the manager we had at the time, he's like, tell people this is the first thing you've ever written, because we want them to think you're a savant. We're like, no, we're not going to lie. This is not the first thing we wrote. And we just don't like living our lives that way. But sometimes you'll read in the trade, it's their first script, and it's not. They've been working at this for years. Yeah. So don't be discouraged that, oh, I wrote a script and it didn't sell. whether it's Oliver Stone, James Cameron, the Wachowskis, they'll tell you the same stories, like their fifth, sixth, or seventh script. They had some miserable survival job, while they were trying to write at nights and on weekends. And that's when you kind of finally, write something good enough that you can finally get attention and sell it.
The average age for the WGA new members, it fluctuates from year to year. It's like from like 32 to 35. So it just shows you that it takes a while for people to actually get good, or at least to be good enough to be a professional writer. Some people get there earlier, some people get there a little later, but that's another barometer to kind of keep on the radar.
So I'm gonna tackle one of these questions really quick. Shalina asked, packaging a script with a good producer and director seems to be a big deal. Do you recommend getting an agent before getting into screenwriting? It sounded like you can't even do that. Like that's not even something that is even an option right now.
Listen, packaging is more important now than ever. Before studios, that was kind of their job, was to bring all the elements together. Now there are a lot of places where they just want you to bring them the script, the director, the actor, and they just want to write a check. Yeah. So packaging is super important. But again, as we were saying, it's very hard. It's basically impossible, especially after the ATA situation and the WGA situation. That's a whole nother story. But it's impossible basically now in 2020 to get an agent to read your script before you're represented. But if we know managers that have taken scripts from writers that have never sold anything and then put a big actor or a director on and have gone off and sold it. And so there is that element of it, and that's going to take longer. That'll probably involve a bunch of rewriting, especially once that manager comes on board. They'll probably become a producer on the project, and that director or actor that they get. There is value to that, but it's first having a script that people will read and respond to.
Sometimes you have to reverse engineer things. I mean, so just look at it from the agent's perspective. They have big agent at CAA, William Morris, wherever, UTA. And so, they get 10% of whatever their client gets. And say they have a big actor or a big director. They want to plug those big actors and directors in the studio jobs. Those are the ones that pay the most. And then you look at the studios, well, what they're trying to do is they're trying to do these big tentpole movies. So when it comes to packaging, it's like, okay, well, first of all, what is this project? What can it potentially be? And then we have to sell it to, does a studio buy this? Or is it going to be a financier play? If it's a financier play, their clients aren't going to get as much money as, say, what Warner Brothers would pay them. Or so the agents focused on plugging their clients, not always, some of the bigger agents, and this doesn't apply to all, and I don't want to make a broad general statement, but oftentimes they're trying to plug their clients into the biggest possible projects where they get the biggest possible payday. So the packaging is very important, but you have to also understand the demands of the marketplace. And if the studios aren't looking for, that package idea, if it's not like a big idea that they feel that they can make it a tentpole, it's going to be a little more of an uphill battle.
Speaking about specific demands, Shalina also asked about COVID filming. As writers, are you guys worried about that at all? Are you worried about situationally writing for COVID? Like bottle films or something that's a big idea, but a way to stay compliant with all the new COVID restrictions?
Yes, it's scary.
What do you think, Darrell?
Yeah, go ahead, Darrell.
Oh yeah, it's just the uncertainty of it all. We all hope that it's going to get better and things can go back to filming, but we just don't know. So, yeah, I'm assuming it greatly affected the marketplace.
It's crushed the marketplace. We've spoken to producers and executives. Right now people are not buying. Yeah. And when this all first kicked off, there was kind of this talk, if we get this under control by Memorial Day or 4th of July, and there's still a path towards production in the fall or in the start of 2021, the studios were still spending money, they were still developing. Now it has all come to a grinding halt for the most part. There's very little development going on. There are big packages that agencies have put together, and the studios have said, we're just not buying right now. Come back to us first quarter of 2021. We'll see where we're at. So listen, obviously, if you write something that is, like you said, like a bottle episode where they're just in one location, that's great. But also know right now that things are so bad that on the feature business, people are just not buying, and this has dragged out so long that that it's really affected the marketplace in a really bad way.
I agree with Charlie, and I agree with what Darrell said too. The uncertainty component of it, it's brought about great uncertainty, and Hollywood does not like uncertainty. You know, they're the antithesis. That's why they do sequels. They feel like there's a certain awareness. Okay, we're familiar with this. They don't like uncertainty, and so I think it's actually affected the business in a much bigger way than we first anticipated, and we thought we would have some clarity by this point in time. And to be honest, I don't think we really have. I'm hoping that'll change as time goes, you know, as we move forward. But it's a real issue, and it's had a massive impact, I would say.
All right. Last thing I want to talk about is what encouragement would you give screenwriters specifically that are starting off their career, and, you know, people who are watching this, or, you know, maybe they're working on their first script or they just finished their first script. What encouragement would you give them to stay in it?
Well, you know, I would just give the advice that was given to us, and this is just for writing. And an older sage writer told us, like, if writing is the oxygen that you need to breathe, to live, if that's how you feel about writing, then don't let anyone discourage you. You know, then you just do it. You'll find a way, and with tenacity, some hard work and talent, and some luck, you'll get there. And I believe that. You know, but if it's just kind of something, I like to dabble in it, and, you know, it's kind of like a passing fancy, then, you know, it's probably not for you, because the adversity it's great. But I feel that what helped us, and Nancy Miller had mentioned this to us, she created Saving Grace and, you know, a couple other TV shows, very, very talented showrunner, very, very talented writer. And she said this, and I'm just kind of going to reiterate what I said before. If you really feel that this is something that you have to do, you will find a way. If you have some talent, as long as you're tenacious, as long as you put in the hard work and the time, you know, at times it feels like you'll never make it, but you will. You'll find your way. You'll somehow get there. And don't give up. Just keep working hard, and do all you can not to have your enthusiasm diminished. And you know, keep honing in on your craft, and try to remain as positive as you can. However you can do that, you know, it's important, and you need to do it, and to stay vigilant.
I agree with everything Vlas said. I know that, like, if you think you'd be happy being a teacher, or, you know, doing something else, if you could live with that, do that, because this is a very hard business. But, you know, when we were starting out, this is what we wanted to do, no matter what it took. No one could dissuade us. We would run through wall after wall, and it was painful, and there were setbacks after setbacks. But we were just like, we are all in on this, and we're going to work as hard as we can, and we're going to keep working, and we're going to be open-minded and kind of, you know, listen and learn. If you do that, you can find a way. It's, you know, someone asked George Lucas once, like, how do you get into the movie business? And his answer was somehow. And you just somehow find a way. This isn't the type of career where it's like, if you want to be a doctor, you go to medical school and then you do your residency. There's no career trajectory. Like, it's the wild, wild west. But the one thing that I think is a positive, which is a huge positive, is that writing is truly a meritocracy. Yeah. This is the one discipline, especially in our business, where they don't care where you went to school, who you know. If you write a good script, people will be interested. It doesn't matter. And what's also great about it is that you don't need anyone's permission to write. It's not like the other discipline, someone has to hire you to direct or hire you to act. You can sit down and start writing. The only person stopping you from writing is you. So what's great is that it is a meritocracy, and you can control your own fate. You just have to be willing to put in the work and the time. The last thing, though, I would just add as a word of caution, because our business has changed so much, and we'll see what happens post-COVID. But the studio system has contracted greatly. They went from making 40 movies a year, 45 movies a year, to now making 15. And a lot of that has to do with the DVD market, and it's a whole nother conversation. Thankfully, over the past 3 years, the streamers have stepped in and are starting to make more movies. And some of the genres that went away, the romantic comedy, the straight comedy, you're seeing them come back on Netflix and on Amazon. But the one thing I will say is that when we were coming up, if you wrote a great feature, that was your entry into the business. And if you sold a feature script, then you could go pitch TV, you could staff, you do anything. Because it is so much harder now to sell a feature, don't just focus yourself on writing a feature. Maybe an idea is a pilot. Maybe an idea is a 20-page anime episode. Like, that's the only thing that, like, because the feature business has contracted so much, find something that excites you and write it. And maybe it's TV, maybe it's shorter format, but that is what should encourage you. No one needs to give you permission to do this. You can sit down, you can write in a notebook, you know, or if you have a computer, you can write on Final Draft. That's the great thing about this business. And if you write something good, people will want it.
Yeah, I think Vlas and Charles said it best. I mean, it's really, if you're passionate about it, then that's the whole key. I mean, if you can be happy doing anything else and maybe writing on the side, and, you know, there's nothing wrong with writing on the side, just as a hobby, and, you know, and becoming, you know, like learning more about film and the screenwriting process. But if you really want to do it as a career, there are a lot of sacrifices to be made, and a lot of hardships to overcome. And I would really, really recommend, and I'm sure both of you could attest to it, like if you have a writing partner or someone, you know, someone on your side, and someone who's not just like a sycophantic on your side, who's like, oh, it's awesome, keep going, buddy, it's great, but someone who can actually challenge your writing, and someone that, you know, preferably a writer who you can make a better writer as well. You know, me and James have a great relationship too. I mean, like, we bounce ideas off each other all the time. You know, some of the best things I've ever written was with James. So, you know, just stick to it. Find someone to be in your corner that you can support too.
That's good advice.
Yeah, and also look for community. Look for writer groups. Even if some people don't feel comfortable writing with another person, I think it helps. I agree with Darrell, and it's great that you guys have worked together. And I also think psychologically there are times where, like, you know, I'll be down and Vlas picks me up, and there's times he's down, I pick him up, because this is a very up and down business. But if you write by yourself, join a writers group. There are tons of them on Facebook. Be a part of that community. You read each other's scripts. You build a sense of camaraderie. In our experience, writers help other writers. That's been our experience. I know it's not true of the other disciplines, but in our end of it, you know, that's always been the case. And so I think that's important. I think it's a really good point you raised there.
Yeah, I would just add that if you get into the film festival side with screenwriting, I found that the other writers in film festivals usually have like alumni groups where, like, you know, everybody gets together, and it's been some of the most supportive people I've ever come across, where they're just very accepting and they just really want to help everybody. It's kind of a weird thing.
You know what? It makes sense though, because they know what, you know, they're in the arena. We're all in the arena. So we know kind of like what writers go through. And it's funny because, like, you know, COVID like affects other industries, but for writers, like, you know, we kind of do this anyway. It didn't really affect us. They're like, well, this is so hard. Well, we kind of do it, you know, and, you know, so that's interesting. And also too, Charlie and I talk about this, and you hit on it a little before. We're really not competing with each other, guys. It's, you know, directors and actors maybe to a certain extent, but writers, no, you're not. It's like the studios want what they want, and then it's not really a competitive thing. And we've never gotten competitive with other writers, and as Charlie has shared, we haven't found that other writers have been that way either. We're all in this together, and, you know, when we hear good news, you know, for another fellow, that's great. Like, you sold it. We know how hard it is to get something sold, and to get something made is always a blessing. So I think it's important to reach out to fellow writers, and to have that group of people. And you know, as Darrell said, if you can have even that one person that can, you know, champion, or like just have some, you know, words of encouragement at times.
Sounding board even too.
Sounding board, huge. We have that with each other. It's huge. And we talked about it before, where you get, like, you know, the half-baked idea, and then you just kind of come to hopefully a good idea. That helps a lot, because at the end of the day too, we always talk about this, writing is solving problems, and you have two minds attacking it, you know, and it helps a lot.
Okay. All right. Well, I think we're about out of time. So where can people find you? How can people follow you? You know, any last closing thoughts?
You know, I'll just say for myself, like, I've gotten on social media lately. I am not that type of person. I can't wait till I retire and I can throw my phone in the ocean and be done with all of that. And so, the one thing I'll say though is that our show, Blood of Zeus, is on Netflix, and if you liked it, or if you watch it, or if you have an interest in Greek mythology, they judge you on the first 30 days of your show whether you'll get renewed. So if you watched it and you liked it, please encourage other people to watch it before December 1st. That's the one thing I'll say.
Yeah. Charlie encapsulated it perfect. That's how I feel too, with the whole media part of it. And yeah, if you guys, like Blood of Zeus, there's still time. Please tell your friends to watch it, because it all depends on viewership, whether or not we get a season 2.
You can find me on Instagram, DK Gabonia. I don't post much. But I appreciate the follow. Smash like and subscribe. I'm just kidding. If you actually want to contact me, you can actually contact me through the Dawn Runner website, which is James's production company.
Awesome. All right, everybody. Well, thank you so much. It was very, very helpful. I feel like it's a lot of great information. And thanks everybody for watching.
Hope everyone's well out there.
Stay safe. Great meeting you guys too.
You too.
Likewise.